She never spoke during the entire flight. Silent, invisible, then both engines exploded. The co-pilot collapsed bleeding. The captain's voice shook. "Any pilots here?" The quiet girl stood up, walked to the cockpit, and took the controls. Everyone stared in shock. Who was she? Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The boarding process for Flight 447 from Seattle to New York proceeded with typical efficiency as passengers filed through the narrow aircraft aisle, dragging carry-on luggage and searching for their assigned seats. Among the stream of travelers, a young woman moved with barely noticeable steps, her presence so unremarkable that even the flight attendants scanning boarding passes seemed to look through her rather than at her. She wore simple dark clothes that blended into the aircraft interior, carried only a small backpack, and kept her eyes focused downward as she navigated towards seat 24F near the rear of the aircraft. Her face showed no expression, no hint of emotion or engagement with the bustling activity surrounding her as 200 passengers settled into their seats for the cross-country journey. The flight attendant working the rear cabin noticed the young woman sliding into the window seat with movements so quiet and economical that she seemed to materialize there rather than arrive through normal boarding. When the attendant approached with the standard greeting and offer of assistance with luggage, the young woman responded with only the slightest nod, her eyes never lifting to make contact, her mouth never opening to speak. The attendant interpreted this as a clear signal that the passenger desired complete privacy and quickly moved on to more responsive travelers who engaged in the usual pre-flight small talk about weather, connections, and travel plans. Throughout the boarding process, the quiet passenger sat motionless in her window seat, staring through the small oval window at the gray tarmac and ground equipment, her face completely blank and her posture suggesting someone who wanted no part of any human interaction during this flight. The middle-aged businessman who took seat 24E attempted friendly conversation as he settled beside her, commenting on the flight delay and asking if she was traveling for business or pleasure. The young woman turned her head slightly toward him, acknowledged his question with an almost imperceptible nod, then immediately returned her gaze to the window without speaking a single word. The businessman tried once more, mentioning something about New York weather, but received no response whatsoever this time. He shrugged, labeled her as antisocial in his mind, and pulled out his laptop to work on spreadsheets, already forgetting her presence entirely. The elderly woman in the aisle seat never bothered attempting conversation at all, sensing from the young woman's body language that she wished to remain completely isolated from everyone around her. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, flight attendants moved through the cabin performing safety demonstrations and checking that seatbelts were properly fastened. When the attendant reached row 24, she glanced at the quiet young woman just long enough to confirm her seatbelt was buckled, then moved on without any verbal interaction, assuming the passenger wanted minimal engagement. The safety demonstration proceeded with its routine instructions about oxygen masks, life vests, and emergency exits while the young woman sat perfectly still, her eyes now closed as if she were attempting to block out not just the noise but the entire experience of being surrounded by 200 strangers in a metal tube about to launch into the sky. The takeoff from Seattle went smoothly as Captain Michael Torres guided the Boeing 767 into the air, the powerful engines propelling the aircraft upward through scattered clouds into clear skies above the Pacific Northwest. Torres had logged 23 years with the airline and had flown this route hundreds of times, making the journey almost automatic despite the complex systems and procedures involved in commanding a wide-body aircraft. Beside him, First Officer David Chen monitored instruments and communications with his usual competence, the two pilots working through their established routine of calls, responses, and system checks as the aircraft climbed toward its cruising altitude of 37,000 feet. Neither pilot had any reason to expect anything unusual about this routine domestic flight that should take approximately 4.5 hours to complete. In the passenger cabin, the quiet young woman remained motionless in her window seat as the aircraft leveled off and the seatbelt sign dinged off. Around her, passengers immediately began their in-flight routines of reading, watching movies on seatback screens, or attempting to sleep through the journey. Flight attendants started their beverage service, moving cart by cart through the cabin taking drink orders and distributing snacks. When the cart reached row 24, the attendant asked the young woman what she would like to drink, speaking in a slightly louder voice as if assuming the passenger might have hearing difficulties. The young woman held up one finger and pointed at a bottle of water, her first gesture of communication beyond simple head movements. The attendant provided the water bottle, received no thank you or acknowledgement, and immediately moved on to the chatty businessman beside her who ordered coffee and began complaining about airline policies regarding checked baggage fees. For the next 2 hours, the young woman sat in complete silence, occasionally sipping from her water bottle but otherwise remaining so still that she seemed almost frozen in place. The businessman beside her had completely forgotten her existence, absorbed in his work. The elderly woman in the aisle seat dozed peacefully. Flight attendants walked past row 24 numerous times during their cabin service but never gave the quiet passenger a second glance, having mentally categorized her as someone requiring no attention or interaction. Other passengers heading to the lavatories at the rear of the aircraft barely noticed her presence as they passed, their eyes sliding over her unremarkable appearance without any registration or memory formation. She had become effectively invisible through her absolute silence and withdrawn behavior, exactly as she intended, fading so completely into the background that not a single person aboard the aircraft would have been able to describe her appearance if asked. The catastrophic failure began without any warning whatsoever as Flight 447 cruised peacefully over the plains of Nebraska at 37,000 feet. One moment the aircraft flew smoothly through clear skies with all systems operating normally, and the next moment a massive explosion erupted from the No. 2 engine mounted on the left wing, the violent detonation sending shockwaves through the entire aircraft structure. The explosion was not the controlled burn of normal jet engine operation but an uncontained engine failure where internal components disintegrated catastrophically, sending turbine blades and metal fragments tearing through the engine casing like shrapnel from a bomb. Passengers throughout the cabin screamed as the aircraft violently shuddered and yawed hard to the left, the sudden asymmetric thrust trying to spin the plane in the direction of the destroyed engine. In the cockpit, Captain Torres and First Officer Chen reacted instantly to the chaos erupting around them as multiple warning systems activated simultaneously, filling the flight deck with urgent audio alerts and flashing red lights. The aircraft shook so violently that Chen's head struck the side window before he could brace himself, the impact stunning him and causing immediate disorientation as blood began flowing from a cut above his eyebrow. Torres fought the controls as the aircraft tried to roll left from the massive thrust imbalance, his hands gripping the yoke with desperate strength while his feet worked the rudder pedals to counteract the uncontrolled yaw. The engine fire warning illuminated for engine number 2, indicating that flaming debris had ignited fuel lines and surrounding components, creating an inferno burning at temperatures hot enough to melt aluminum and compromise wing structural integrity. Torres initiated the engine fire memory items without hesitation, his hands moving automatically through procedures drilled into his muscle memory through thousands of hours of training and practice. He pulled the fire handle for engine number 2, cutting off fuel flow and triggering the fire suppression system that released halon gas into the engine compartment. But even as he completed these emergency actions, he knew with growing horror that this failure was far worse than anything covered in simulator training scenarios. The explosion had been so violent that hydraulic lines running through the wing had been severed, and now 2 of the aircraft's 3 hydraulic systems were showing zero pressure as their vital fluid drained away through holes torn by engine fragments. Without hydraulic pressure, the flight controls became increasingly heavy and unresponsive, requiring Torres to use physical strength far beyond normal piloting demands just to keep the aircraft from entering an uncontrollable spiral. The situation deteriorated even further as Torres attempted to declare an emergency and request immediate vectors to the nearest airport. Engine number 1 on the left wing, which had been operating normally, suddenly began showing abnormal vibrations and temperature readings as debris from the exploded engine damaged its intake and compressor sections. Torres realized with sick certainty that he was losing both engines on the left wing, which would leave the aircraft with only the 2 engines on the right wing providing thrust. Flying any aircraft with asymmetric power was challenging but manageable under normal circumstances, but flying a crippled widebody jet with damaged hydraulics and power available on only one side represented an almost impossible situation that would require 2 fully functional pilots working in perfect coordination to have any chance of survival. Torres turned to give instructions to his first officer and saw Chen slumped in his seat, blood covering the right side of his face, his eyes unfocused and his hands trembling as he tried to reach for controls but couldn't seem to coordinate his movements properly. The head impact had caused a concussion severe enough that Chen could no longer perform his duties, leaving Torres completely alone to manage an emergency that absolutely required two pilots to handle the complex simultaneous tasks of flying the damaged aircraft, communicating with air traffic control, running emergency checklists, calculating fuel requirements for emergency landing, and preparing the cabin for a potential crash landing. Torres felt his heart racing as the terrible mathematics of the situation became clear in his mind. He could not do this alone. He needed help immediately, someone with pilot training who could sit in the right seat and act as his first officer for the emergency procedures that must be completed in the next few minutes or everyone aboard this aircraft would die. The captain made a decision that violated every protocol and procedure he had learned in his 23-year career but represented the only possible chance for survival. He switched the public address system to manual and spoke into the microphone with a voice that he forced to remain calm despite the terror threatening to overwhelm his professional composure. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain speaking. We have experienced a serious emergency that requires immediate assistance. I need to know right now if there are any pilots aboard this aircraft. Any rated pilots with multi-engine experience, please identify yourselves immediately to the flight attendants. This is not a drill. I repeat, any pilots aboard, please make yourselves known immediately. The announcement sent waves of panic through the passenger cabin as 200 people absorbed the horrifying implications of their captain begging for help from passengers, the situation clearly so desperate that normal procedures had completely broken down. In seat 24F, the quiet young woman's eyes snapped open as the captain's words penetrated her self-imposed isolation. For the first time since boarding, her face showed expression, but not panic or fear like the passengers screaming around her. Her expression showed recognition, calculation, and the sudden focused intensity of a professional responding to an emergency in their area of expertise. She unbuckled her seatbelt with smooth efficient movements and stood up, her previous withdrawn posture replaced by confident bearing as she stepped into the aisle. The businessman beside her barely noticed her movement, too busy clutching his armrests in terror as the aircraft continued its unnatural shaking and the smell of smoke began filtering into the cabin from the damaged engines. The young woman moved forward through the chaos with purposeful steps, ignoring the flight attendants trying to calm hysterical passengers and the overhead bins that had popped open to spill luggage into the aisle from the violent maneuvers. Lead flight attendant Sarah Matthews was near the forward galley trying to coordinate evacuation procedures when she saw the quiet young woman from the rear cabin approaching with determined strides. Matthews started to order her back to her seat but stopped when she saw the young woman's expression, something in those eyes conveying authority and competence that cut through the panic. "I'm a pilot," the young woman said, speaking for the first time since boarding the aircraft, her voice quiet but absolutely steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "I have commercial ratings and emergency training. Tell the captain I'm coming to the cockpit right now." Her tone allowed no argument or doubt, carrying the unmistakable confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing in a situation where everyone else was operating beyond their capabilities. Matthews made an instant decision to trust this mysterious passenger who had materialized from nowhere with claims of pilot credentials and emergency expertise. She grabbed the cockpit intercom and informed Torres that a pilot was coming forward, then stepped aside as the young woman moved past her toward the reinforced cockpit door. Torres unlocked the door from inside, and the young woman entered the flight deck, quickly assessing the situation with a trained pilot's systematic scan of instruments, controls, and crew status. She saw the blood-covered first officer slumped uselessly in the right seat, saw the captain fighting controls with muscles visibly straining from the effort of wrestling the crippled aircraft, saw the multiple red warning lights and system failure indications covering the instrument panel, and immediately understood that this situation was far beyond typical emergency procedures. "I'm Emma Chen," she said as she moved toward the first officer's seat, her voice calm and professional as if she were introducing herself in a simulator rather than a dying aircraft. "Commercial pilot, type rated on 767, former Air Force instructor pilot. 15 years experience including emergency systems and engine failure recovery. What's your status?" Torres glanced at her with desperate hope mixed with doubt, seeing only a young woman who looked barely old enough to have the experience she claimed, but he had no choice except to trust her because without help he would lose control of the aircraft within minutes. "Captain Michael Torres," he responded while continuing to fight the controls. "Uncontained failure of Engine 2, lost 2 hydraulic systems, Engine 1 showing damage from debris, first officer incapacitated from head trauma. I need you in the right seat immediately helping me fly this thing." Emma didn't waste time with further conversation as she helped Chin out of his seat with surprising strength for her small frame, then slid into the first officer's position and immediately began scanning instruments and systems with the rapid efficiency of someone who had occupied this seat hundreds of times before. Her hands moved over controls and switches with practiced precision as she quickly verified aircraft configuration, remaining engine status, hydraulic system condition, and flight control responsiveness. Torres felt a surge of hope as he watched her work, recognizing the movements of a genuinely experienced pilot rather than someone merely familiar with cockpit layout. She knew exactly where to look, exactly which instruments mattered in this emergency, exactly what information she needed to help him save this aircraft and everyone aboard. "Give me control of throttles and rudder," Emma said without looking at Torres, her eyes fixed on the engine instruments showing the failing condition of the left-wing power plants. "You maintain pitch and roll, I'll handle power management and yaw control. Engine 2 is completely destroyed, Engine 1 is failing from foreign object damage and needs to be shut down before it tears itself apart. We're going to have to fly this approach on engines 3 and 4 only, both on the right wing, which means massive thrust asymmetry and constant rudder input to keep us coordinated." Torres felt his muscles relax slightly as he realized this young woman truly understood the impossible situation they faced and had already formed a plan for managing the emergency that demonstrated both technical knowledge and practical experience with extreme aircraft malfunctions. Torres released rudder control to Emma while maintaining his death grip on the yoke to control the aircraft's pitch and roll attitudes. Emma's feet immediately went to work on the rudder pedals, applying constant right rudder pressure to counteract the asymmetric thrust that was trying to spin the aircraft in circles. Her left hand moved to the throttle quadrant where she carefully managed the power settings on the 2 remaining good engines, adjusting thrust continuously to balance the need for altitude maintenance against the structural stress on the aircraft's damaged systems. "We need to slow down," she said, her voice remaining perfectly calm despite the extreme circumstances. "Current speed is creating too much stress on the damaged hydraulic lines and control surfaces. I'm reducing power on 3 and 4 to slow us to minimum maneuvering speed, which will reduce structural loads but also reduce our control authority." Torres nodded agreement as Emma gradually reduced power on the 2 operating engines, feeling the aircraft decelerate and settle into a more stable but far more precarious flight condition where they were barely above stall speed but with significantly reduced forces trying to tear the damaged aircraft apart. "What's your nearest suitable airport?" Emma asked while she cross-checked navigation displays. "We need a long runway with full emergency services and we need to get there in the next 15 minutes before the remaining hydraulic system fails completely or before these 2 good engines overheat from the power imbalance and shut themselves down." Torres had already computed this in his mind and responded immediately. "Denver International is our best option, bearing 210 degrees, distance 112 miles, multiple long runways, full emergency equipment standing by. I've already declared emergency with center and they're clearing all traffic out of our way." Emma's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she helped Torres turn the aircraft toward Denver while maintaining the delicate power balance required to keep them airborne. The aircraft felt sluggish and unresponsive, each control input requiring excessive force and producing minimal results as the damaged hydraulic system struggled to move flight control surfaces against the massive aerodynamic forces acting on them. Torres realized that he could never have made this turn alone, could never have maintained coordinated flight through such a radical heading change with only one functioning pilot, but with Emma managing power and rudder while he concentrated on pitch and roll, they accomplished the turn without losing control or entering the death spiral that had seemed inevitable just minutes before. "I need you to calculate landing performance," Torres said as they rolled out on course toward Denver. "We're heavy with fuel, we're going to be flying an engine-out approach on the asymmetric side, and we have essentially no hydraulic reserves for landing flaps or thrust reversers. I need to know our minimum runway length, our approach speed, and our landing distance numbers right now. Emma's right hand moved to the flight management computer where she began entering the parameters for the most difficult landing calculation any pilot would ever need to perform, accounting for all the system failures, the asymmetric thrust condition, the reduced control authority, and the extra weight from fuel they couldn't dump because the fuel dump system required hydraulic pressure they no longer possessed. While Emma worked the landing calculations, Torres fought to maintain altitude and heading as the aircraft continued its unnatural vibrations and the acrid smell of burning electrical components began filtering into the cockpit from somewhere in the systems below. He keyed the radio and provided air traffic control with updates on their deteriorating condition, requesting that emergency vehicles be positioned at the runway to respond the instant they touched down because the smoking engines and damaged systems made post-landing fire a significant probability. The controller's voice responded with professional calm, clearing them for a straight-in approach to Denver's longest runway and confirming that every emergency vehicle in the city was already rolling toward the airport to provide whatever assistance might be needed. Emma completed her calculations and Torres felt his stomach drop as she reported the numbers he had been dreading. "We need minimum 7,000 feet of runway," she said, her voice still remarkably steady. "Approach speed 185 knots, no flaps available so we're coming in fast and hot. Landing distance assuming normal braking is 9,000 feet, but with our degraded hydraulics we could easily exceed 10,000 feet before we stop. Denver's runway 34 right is 12,000 feet, which gives us a 2,000-foot safety margin if everything goes perfectly during the landing rollout. If anything else fails, if we lose steering authority or if the brakes don't work properly, we're going off the end into the dirt." Torres absorbed this information and made peace with the reality that they were attempting a landing with almost zero margin for error, where the slightest mistake or the smallest additional system failure would turn their already damaged aircraft into a fireball at the end of a runway. But they had no choice because continuing to fly was not an option when hydraulic pressure was slowly bleeding away and the two remaining engines were operating far beyond their normal stress limits just to keep the crippled aircraft airborne. "We're committed," he said simply. "Start the approach checklist and let's get this thing on the ground before anything else decides to break." Emma began running through the approach checklist, calling out items and confirming system configurations while Torres hand flew the aircraft toward the approach course for runway 34 right. The normal routine of checklist completion helped focus their minds and suppress the fear that threatened to overwhelm rational thought as they prepared for what both pilots knew was likely to be a crash rather than a landing. Emma's voice never wavered as she called items and received Torres' responses, her professionalism and competence creating a bubble of order and procedure in the chaos surrounding them. Torres found himself drawing strength from her calm demeanor, wondering what circumstances had caused this obviously skilled pilot to be traveling as a passenger rather than serving in a cockpit where she clearly belonged. The approach to Denver International Airport proceeded with agonizing slowness as Torres and Emma worked together to maintain control of the aircraft while descending toward the runway that represented their only hope for survival. Every mile required constant tiny adjustments to power, rudder, pitch, and roll as they compensated for the asymmetric thrust and degraded flight controls that made the aircraft want to spiral out of control. Emma's feet worked continuously on the rudder pedals, applying varying pressure to keep the aircraft coordinated as airspeed changed and power settings adjusted, her leg muscles burning from the sustained effort of fighting the massive rudder forces. Torres' arms ached from the physical exertion of controlling pitch and roll through the heavy, unresponsive yoke that felt like it was mired in cement rather than connected to aerodynamic control surfaces. Air traffic control vectored them onto the final approach course 20 miles from the runway, and Torres could see the airport in the distance with its distinctive tent-like terminal roof and multiple parallel runways stretching across the high plains east of the city. He could also see the flashing lights of dozens of emergency vehicles surrounding the approach end of runway 34 right, the fire trucks and ambulances positioned to respond immediately when the crippled aircraft either landed successfully or crashed attempting to do so. The sight of those emergency vehicles made the danger absolutely real in a way that instrument readings and system failures had not, forcing Torres to confront the distinct possibility that he and Emma and the 200 souls depending on them might not survive the next few minutes. Emma seemed to sense Torres' moment of doubt because she spoke without taking her eyes off her instruments and controls. "We can do this," she said with quiet confidence. "I've recovered from worse situations than this in training scenarios and real emergencies. You have the skills, I have the experience, and together we have enough capability to put this aircraft on that runway in one piece. Trust your training, trust my support, and trust that we're both good enough pilots to pull this off." Her words cut through Torres' fear and restored his professional focus, reminding him that he had successfully handled countless emergencies throughout his career and that this emergency, while more severe than most, was still just another problem requiring technical skills and procedural knowledge to solve. They crossed the final approach fix 10 miles from the runway threshold at 3,000 feet above ground level, properly aligned with the runway centerline and on the correct glide path despite the damaged condition of their aircraft. Torres began gradually reducing power while Emma maintained rudder pressure to keep them coordinated, both pilots working in perfect synchronization as if they had flown together for years rather than minutes. The aircraft descended smoothly through 2,000 feet, then 1,500 feet, then 1,000 feet as the runway grew larger in the windscreen and the moment of truth approached with every passing second. Torres could see individual markings on the runway pavement now, could see the emergency vehicles scattered along both sides waiting for their arrival, could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he prepared for the most difficult landing he would ever attempt. At 500 feet above the ground, Emma called out their altitude, airspeed, and descent rate in a steady cadence that kept Torres informed without overwhelming him with excess information. 500 feet, 187 knots, 700 feet per minute descent, on glide path, her calm voice reported. Torres made tiny corrections to maintain the perfect approach path they needed to land safely on the first few thousand feet of runway where they had any hope of stopping before running out of pavement. Every instinct he possessed wanted him to flare early and land gently to spare the damaged aircraft additional stress, but Emma's experience told her they needed to land firmly and immediately begin maximum braking to have any chance of stopping in the available distance. 200 feet, 185 knots, 600 feet per minute, Emma called as they descended through the last moments before touchdown. Torres could see the runway threshold passing beneath them, could see the touchdown zone markings appearing directly ahead, could feel every muscle in his body tense for the impact that would determine if they lived or died. 100 feet, maintain speed, Emma said, then, 50 feet, looking good, stay with it. Torres held the approach angle as they dropped the final few feet, then pulled back slightly on the yoke to arrest their descent rate just before the main landing gear contacted the runway with a heavy thump that sent shudders through the entire aircraft structure. The moment the wheels touched pavement, Emma immediately deployed speed brakes and began applying maximum braking pressure despite knowing their degraded hydraulic system might not provide full braking capability. Torres held the nose wheel off the runway for as long as possible to increase aerodynamic drag, then gently lowered it to the pavement and added his braking pressure to Emma's as they fought to decelerate the heavy aircraft that wanted to continue rolling at high speed toward the rapidly approaching end of the runway. The emergency vehicles paced them down the runway, ready to respond if flames erupted from the smoking engines or if the aircraft veered off the pavement from loss of steering control, their flashing lights creating a surreal escort for the crippled jet that had somehow survived the impossible. The aircraft decelerated with agonizing slowness as Torres and Emma applied maximum braking force and the anti-skid system struggled to prevent the wheels from locking up on the concrete surface. Torres watched the runway distance markers flashing past, watched the remaining pavement shrinking ahead of them, watched the end of the runway approaching with terrifying speed despite their heavy braking. At what seemed like the last possible moment, the aircraft finally slowed to taxi speed with 1,500 feet of runway remaining, giving them just enough distance to complete their rollout and turn off onto a high-speed taxiway where they brought the aircraft to a complete stop surrounded by emergency vehicles with firefighters already spraying foam on the smoking engines to prevent any possibility of fire ignition. Torres sat motionless in his seat for several seconds, his hands still gripping the yoke with white-knuckled force, his entire body shaking with the adrenaline aftermath of the most intense 30 minutes of his life. Beside him, Emma remained completely calm as she methodically secured the aircraft systems, shutting down the 2 remaining engines, setting parking brake, and completing the parking checklist as if this were a normal arrival rather than a desperate emergency landing that had just saved 200 lives. She worked with smooth efficiency until every required action was completed, then finally allowed herself to relax slightly as she turned to look at Torres with something approaching a smile on her previously emotionless face. "Good flying, Captain," she said quietly. "That was some of the best emergency handling I've seen, and I've trained hundreds of pilots on worst-case scenarios. You kept your composure when everything was falling apart and you trusted a complete stranger to help you save this aircraft. That takes courage as much as skill." Torres felt tears forming in his eyes as the full weight of what they had accomplished began to penetrate his shocked mind. They had survived. Against all odds, against every probability, they had brought the catastrophically damaged aircraft safely to the ground without killing anyone, an outcome that had seemed impossible when the engines first exploded over Nebraska. Outside the cockpit, flight attendants were already initiating evacuation procedures as passengers flooded toward the emergency exits, desperate to escape the smoking aircraft that had so nearly killed them. But Torres knew there would be no evacuation slides deployed, no dramatic escape down emergency chutes, because Emma's expert flying had allowed them to land normally and taxi clear of the runway, giving passengers the luxury of deplaning through jetways like any normal arrival rather than fleeing for their lives across airport grass. The enormity of the disaster they had avoided began to sink in as Torres imagined the alternative outcomes, the smoking crater that would have resulted if he had attempted this landing alone without Emma's help, the 200 names that would have appeared on tomorrow's news as casualties of another aviation tragedy. Torres unbuckled his seatbelt and turned to face Emma fully, seeing her clearly for the first time rather than as just another crew member helping him manage the emergency. She looked young, probably early 30s, with tired eyes that had seen far too much stress and trauma for someone her age. "I need to know," he said carefully. "Where did you learn to fly like that?" "You said Air Force, instructor pilot, 15 years experience. That means you started flying when you were what, teenager? And why were you sitting in the back of my aircraft instead of in this cockpit where you obviously belong?" Emma's expression closed down slightly as if Torres had touched on subjects she preferred not to discuss, but after what they had just survived together she apparently felt she owed him some explanation. "I started flying when I was 16, she said softly. "My father was Air Force, fighter pilot, and he started teaching me in his private plane as soon as I was legally allowed to fly. I went to the Air Force Academy, became a pilot, flew cargo and tanker aircraft, then became an instructor training new pilots at various bases. I was good at it, really good, loved every minute of it. Then 3 months ago my father died in a crash during an airshow performance. Small mechanical failure, should have been survivable, but he made one tiny mistake in his emergency procedures and that was enough. Suddenly flying wasn't joy anymore, it was terror and memories and loss." She paused and Torres saw the pain in her eyes as she continued. "I resigned my commission, walked away from 15 years of service, and tried to figure out what to do with my life when the only thing I knew and loved had become unbearable. Today was supposed to be my first flight as a passenger, trying to prove to myself that I could still be on an aircraft without having panic attacks. I sat in back, stayed silent, tried to make myself invisible, thinking if I didn't engage with the flying part of the experience I could get through it. Then your engines exploded and suddenly I wasn't a traumatized pilot trying to hide from my past, I was the only person on this aircraft with the training and experience needed to help you save everyone aboard. Instinct and training took over, the fear disappeared, and I did what I was trained to do." Torres felt his throat tighten as he absorbed Emma's story and realized the extraordinary courage it must have required for her to enter this cockpit and take controls when flying had become associated with her father's death and her own psychological trauma. She had saved them all despite her own pain, had set aside her fear to use her skills when they were desperately needed, had proven that true pilots never completely lose their edge no matter how much time passes or how much trauma they experience. "You saved 200 lives today," Torres said firmly. "Including mine. I don't care what pain you've been carrying or what fear you've been fighting, you are one hell of a pilot and you deserve to be flying professionally, not hiding in the back of someone else's aircraft." Before Emma could respond, the cockpit door opened and paramedics entered to assess injuries and provide medical attention to the bloodied first officer who was finally regaining full consciousness and asking confused questions about what had happened. Behind the paramedics came airline officials, FAA inspectors, and the flood of authorities who always appeared after aviation emergencies to document events, collect evidence, and begin the investigation process that would determine exactly what had caused the catastrophic engine failure. Torres and Emma spent the next hour answering questions, providing statements, and reliving the emergency in excruciating detail for officials who needed to understand every decision, every action, every moment of the flight that had so nearly ended in disaster. Through all the questioning and documentation, Torres insisted that investigators understand Emma's critical role in the successful outcome, repeatedly emphasizing that he could not have saved the aircraft without her expert assistance and that her flying skills had been absolutely essential to their survival. The investigators showed appropriate interest in a passenger pilot who had saved a commercial flight, but Torres could see they were skeptical about his claims regarding Emma's capabilities, probably assuming he was exaggerating out of gratitude or shock. Their skepticism annoyed Torres because he knew exactly how skilled Emma was and how her expertise had exceeded even his own considerable experience with emergency procedures and aircraft handling. As the immediate post-flight chaos began to settle, Torres and Emma finally escaped the aircraft and made their way through the terminal where passengers who had been aboard the flight mobbed them with gratitude, tears, and expressions of thanks for saving their lives. The quiet girl who had been invisible and overlooked during boarding now found herself surrounded by people who wanted to shake her hand, hug her, tell her she was a hero. Emma handled the attention with the same calm professionalism she had shown in the cockpit, accepting thanks graciously but deflecting praise toward Torres and the flight attendants who had managed the cabin emergency and kept passengers calm during the crisis. Several passengers expressed shock that the quiet woman they had ignored or dismissed as antisocial had turned out to be the pilot who saved them all, their eyes wide as they realized how badly they had misjudged her during the flight. The businessman from seat 24E apologized profusely for his earlier dismissive thoughts, and the elderly woman from 24D held Emma's hands while crying and blessing her for having the courage to come forward. Emma accepted their words without comment, understanding that people made judgments based on limited information and that her deliberate choice to remain withdrawn had naturally caused others to overlook her presence and capabilities. The local news media arrived at the airport within an hour, their cameras and microphones seeking statements from Torres and Emma about the dramatic emergency landing that was already being called miraculous by aviation experts who reviewed the preliminary damage assessments showing just how catastrophically damaged the aircraft had been. Torres gave several interviews describing the engine failure and the desperate moment when he realized he needed help to survive, praising Emma's skills and emphasizing that she deserved full credit for the successful outcome. Emma initially tried to avoid the cameras but eventually gave one brief interview where she spoke about training, preparation, and the importance of staying calm during emergencies rather than dwelling on her personal story or emotional journey. That evening, as Torres sat in his hotel room watching news coverage of Flight 447's emergency landing, he saw aviation experts analyzing the incident and expressing amazement that the aircraft had been landed safely given the extent of damage documented by investigators. The uncontained engine failure had sent fragments through the wing structure, severing multiple critical systems and creating a situation that should have resulted in complete loss of control and an unsurvivable crash. Multiple experts stated flatly that the successful landing demonstrated extraordinary piloting skill beyond what should be expected from a normal crew, particularly given that the first officer had been incapacitated and unavailable to assist during the most critical phases of the emergency. Torres picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number Emma had given him before they separated at the airport, her personal contact information exchanged with mutual promises to stay in touch after their shared trauma and triumph. He composed a text message carefully, wanting to say the right thing to the woman who had saved his life and proven herself to be an exceptional pilot despite her current struggles with flying. "You showed today why you belong in cockpits, not passenger seats," he typed. "The Air Force's loss is aviation's gain, but you're too skilled to waste your talents. When you're ready to fly again professionally, call me. I know every chief pilot in this industry and I will personally vouch for your abilities. You deserve to be where your skills can help others like you helped me today." Emma's response came several minutes later, just 3 words that somehow conveyed volumes about her state of mind and her gradual recognition that perhaps she could reclaim her identity as a pilot despite the trauma and loss that had driven her away from flying. "Thank you, Michael," her message read. using his first name for the first time and acknowledging the bond they had formed during those desperate 30 minutes when they had fought together to save 200 lives. Torres smiled as he read her words, knowing that he had witnessed something remarkable today, watching a broken pilot rediscover her purpose and capabilities through the crucible of an impossible emergency that had required her to set aside fear and pain to do what she had been trained to do. The investigation into Flight 447's engine failure would eventually reveal that a manufacturing defect in a turbine disc had caused the catastrophic explosion, a flaw that existed in engines throughout the airline's fleet and required immediate inspections and replacements to prevent similar failures. The uncontained failure had been particularly severe, sending debris through the wing with such force that it damaged multiple systems simultaneously and created a compound emergency that exceeded standard training scenarios for severity and complexity. Investigators concluded that Captain Torres' decision to seek help from a passenger pilot had been both unprecedented and absolutely correct, representing quick thinking and leadership under the most extreme pressure that any commercial pilot would ever face. Emma received formal recognition from the FAA, the airline, and multiple aviation organizations for her actions during the emergency, though she remained uncomfortable with the attention and praise that followed. She granted a few more interviews over the subsequent weeks, always emphasizing training and preparation rather than her personal heroism, always deflecting credit toward Torres and the flight crew who had managed their responsibilities during the crisis. But Torres could see during their occasional phone conversations that something had shifted in Emma's perspective on flying, that the trauma of her father's death was beginning to be balanced by the satisfaction of having used her skills to save lives rather than being helpless to prevent loss. 3 months after the emergency landing, Torres received a call from Emma that made him break into a wide grin despite being in the middle of a pre-flight briefing with his new first officer. "I've been talking to a few airlines about returning to flying," Emma said, her voice stronger and more confident than Torres remembered from their initial conversations. "Turns out having a dramatic emergency landing on your resume opens doors when you're looking for pilot positions. I've got 3 different offers for first officer positions on wide-body aircraft, and one of the chief pilots specifically mentioned that you had contacted him and provided the strongest recommendation he'd ever received for any pilot candidate. So thank you for that, Michael. Thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." Torres felt genuine happiness at Emma's words, knowing that aviation was regaining an exceptionally skilled pilot who had proven her capabilities under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. "You earned every word of that recommendation," Torres replied honestly. "I told them the truth, that you're the best pilot I've ever flown with in an emergency, that your skills and composure saved my life and 200 passengers, and that any airline would be lucky to have you in their cockpit. Where are you leaning toward accepting?" Emma's answer surprised and delighted him. "I'm thinking about the airline you fly for," she said with audible smile in her voice. "They've offered me a position as a 767 first officer, and the chief pilot mentioned that after I complete my training and line checks, there's a possibility I might end up flying with a certain captain who specifically requested me as his first officer whenever scheduling permits. Apparently this captain told management that he'd fly with me over any other first officer in the fleet because he's seen my emergency skills firsthand and knows exactly what I'm capable of when things go wrong." Torres laughed genuinely for the first time since the emergency, feeling a deep satisfaction that their shared trauma had resulted in Emma reclaiming her identity as a pilot and potentially forming a long-term flying partnership where they could work together in the profession they both loved. "That captain sounds like a smart guy who recognizes exceptional talent when he sees it," Torres said warmly. "I hope you accept that position, Emma. Aviation needs pilots like you, pilots who can handle the impossible and save lives when everything goes wrong. But more than that, I think you need to be flying again. Today proved that to both of us." 2 months later, Captain Michael Torres stood in operations reviewing his flight assignment for the day and smiled when he saw First Officer Emma Chen's name listed beside his own on the crew roster for Flight 1893 from New York to Los Angeles. It would be their first flight together since that desperate emergency over Nebraska, their first time working as a normal crew without catastrophic failures and life-threatening emergencies demanding every ounce of their skill and concentration. Torres felt confident and relaxed knowing that Emma would occupy the right seat, that they had already proven their ability to work together under the worst possible circumstances, that their crew coordination and mutual trust had been forged in the crucible of an emergency that should have killed them all. Emma arrived at the gate with her flight bag and uniform looking professional and confident, very different from the withdrawn silent passenger Torres had first met during the worst moments of his career. She greeted him with a smile and a firm handshake, and they completed their pre-flight briefing with the easy competence of experienced pilots who understood each other's capabilities and communication styles. As they walked together toward their aircraft, Torres reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment, from the desperate "Any pilots here?" announcement to Emma's quiet approach to the cockpit to their successful emergency landing to her recovery and return to professional flying. "Ready to fly, First Officer Chen?" Torres asked as they climbed the stairs to the aircraft. Emma's response was immediate and genuine. "Ready to fly, Captain Torres. Let's hope this one is significantly more boring than the last time we worked together." And as they settled into their respective seats in the cockpit and began the familiar routines of flight preparation, Torres knew that however their careers progressed from this point forward, he would always remember the quiet girl who had saved his life and 200 passengers through skill, courage, and an expertise that remained hidden until the moment when it became absolutely essential for survival. Aviation was full of stories about extraordinary pilots who performed beyond normal human capabilities during emergencies, but Emma's story held special significance because she had overcome not just technical challenges but profound personal trauma to use her skills exactly when they mattered most. She had proven that true pilots never completely lose their edge, that training and expertise remain accessible even through pain and loss, and that sometimes the most capable people are those who others overlook completely until circumstances force them to reveal capabilities that exceed everyone's expectations.